Before there were diners, before there were drive-thrus, before frozen meals in cardboard boxes, there was the cookhouse. A low log building at the edge of the frozen woods, smoke rising from a pipe before the sun came up, and a man they called Godamighty standing at a cast-iron stove, feeding 100 men who had 12 hours of hard labor ahead of them. 6,000 calories a day, sometimes 9,000, in weather that froze your boots to the floor. They had a whole language for the food. They had rituals built around it. They had a list of things that came to the table every single morning. And one by one, as the logging camps emptied and the forests thinned and the men came home to suburbs and supermarkets, those breakfasts just quietly vanished. Nobody banned them. Nobody decided they were obsolete. The world that needed them simply closed its doors. Today we are bringing 25 of them back to the table. Stick around to number 8. That is the one they buried in the ground every single night, so it would be ready for breakfast. Let's start at number 1. Number 1. Sweatpad flapjacks. That is what they called them, sweatpads. Thick flapjacks the size of a man's hand, stacked 4, 5, 6 high, with a slab of butter melting down through every layer and maple syrup poured from a pitcher that came out of a barrel. The barrel of syrup was delivered by wagon at the start of the season, and it did not last long. These men needed carbohydrates, real ones, the kind that burn slow through a 12-hour shift in sub-zero temperatures. A lumberjack might put away 8 or 10 of these before the sun cleared the tree line. The table had no conversation. The rule was no talking. 100 men eating in near silence, focused on the food because slow eaters would be hungry by mid-morning. They called pancakes sweatpads. Because you worked so hard, you sweated through them by 9 in the morning. The name stuck. The tradition did not. Number 2, oatmeal porridge. Not the kind from a packet. Not the kind with flavored dust stirred in. This was rolled oats cooked in a heavy pot, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, served in tin bowls alongside everything else on the table. The cook served it on days when he needed to stretch the menu, but also because oats were one of the few things that kept without spoiling deep into the season. Once the perishables ran out, and they always ran out faster than planned, you fell back on oats. The men ate it without complaint. Hunger, as one camp historian put it, was the best sauce. Number 3. Salt pork fried in its own grease, not bacon. Salt pork. There is a difference, and it matters. Bacon is cured and smoked, cut thin, intended to crisp. Salt pork is a thick slab of fatback preserved in brine with very little actual meat to it. You slice it and throw it in the pan and it renders itself. The fat becomes the cooking fat. The lean bits brown and stiffen at the edges. In the 1880s in the Great Lakes logging camps, this was the primary protein at breakfast most mornings. Charles Ellis is a Boston writer who visited northern Michigan in 1885, described it plainly. Fried pork stuck fast in half-cold pork grease. Served without ceremony to men who were too tired to complain and too hungry to refuse. It was functional, dense, unglamorous. And for 30 years, it was the smell of breakfast across 1 million acres of American forest. Number 4. Black tea strong enough to float an axe on. That is the actual description from a man who was there. Stuart Holbrook, in his classic history of American lumbering called Holy Old Mackinaw, said the standard drink in 19th century logging camps was black tea, brewed so strong and left to boil so long that it could float an axe on the surface. Served in tin cups that were never fully washed, with a brown sediment coating the inside from months of overboiling. No sugar, no milk, just heat and tannin and the smell of wood smoke. Charles Ellis described the process with barely contained horror. Tea boiled down, filled back up, kept boiling from meal to meal, dished out grounds and all into measures half filled with lukewarm water. The men drank it by the gallon. In the Pacific Northwest camps, a decade later, it got replaced by coffee. But for a generation of Great Lakes lumberjacks, this was the morning drink. And nobody who had it is left to describe the taste. Number 5, sourdough biscuits. Not baking powder biscuits. Not the kind from a can. A sourdough starter that the camp cook kept alive through the entire season, fed every night, used every morning. In 1902, a University of Maine scientist visited a logging camp in the deep winter woods and spent 18 days documenting everything the men ate. His results were published in a 1904 United States Department of Agriculture bulletin. The finding on sourdough biscuits: constant supply. They appeared at breakfast. They appeared at the noon meal. They appeared at supper. The cook pulled them from the oven in batches that filled entire sheet pans, and they were gone in minutes. The starter itself was one of the most closely guarded things in the cookhouse. A cook who let his starter die had a problem. There was no general store a mile down the road. Number 6. Donuts fried in lard. Donuts fried in lard. Carrie Blodorn, director of the Pioneer Park Historical Complex in Wisconsin, put it this way: donuts were fried in lard and a camp staple. Nothing fancy ever. But after a 12-hour shift in the frozen woods, nobody was complaining to get sugar any way it came. The fat-fried donut was the cookie of the logging world. Simple, calorie-dense, made in enormous batches, and stacked at the end of the table like a resource to be rationed. They were not the glazed rings of a modern bakery. They were old-fashioned cake donuts, dense and a little chewy, fried hard. They lasted through the cold. And because lard was one of the things the supply wagon always carried. Lard kept, salt pork kept, flour kept. They were always possible to make regardless of what else had run out. Number 7. Prunes, every single meal. This one surprises people, but the historical record is clear. Prunes appeared at virtually every meal in most logging camps, not as a treat, as a staple. They were dried, they kept indefinitely, they added sweetness to a table that was otherwise dominated by salt and fat, and, as the camp historian Willa Hammett Brown noted, they were popular for keeping the men regular. 100 men with a bowel problem is a disruption nobody wanted. So prunes came to the table at breakfast alongside the flapjacks and salt pork. And they came again at the noon meal, and sometimes at supper. Nobody rhapsodizes about them. No living history museum recreates them. But they were there every single morning in camps across Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin for 30 years. Number 8. Whole beans. Stick with this one, because this is the one that will haunt you. Every morning at logging camps across Maine and the Great Lakes, a man dug up breakfast. Not found it, not cooked it. Dug it up from the ground. Because the night before, the cook's assistant, had taken a cast iron kettle, layered it with soaked beans and slabs of salt pork and sliced onions and a drizzle of dark molasses, put the lid on tight, and lowered it into a fire-heated pit in the earth. Then he buried it. Under hot coals and packed dirt, inside a lean-to structure that every single camp built specifically for this purpose. The beans cooked underground through the night, 12 to 16 hours, emerging at dawn thick and dark and laced with pork fat and molasses. The 1904 USDA study called Baked Beans the most important single article of diet for American lumberjacks. Men ate 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of them every day. They showed up at breakfast, They showed up at lunch. They showed up at supper. And on the river drive, the most dangerous weeks of the season, when men were guiding logs down ice-cold rivers, the diet was stripped to almost nothing else. Beans, sourdough biscuit, molasses, 5 times a day. That was survival. That was the meal that kept men alive in conditions that would kill most of us in 48 hours. Nobody makes whole beans anymore. The pits are all filled in. Number 9. Creamed dried beef on fried cornmeal mush. This one comes from an actual preserved breakfast menu, a document that survived from a logging camp in the early 1900s. Creamed dried beef was exactly what the name says. Dried, preserved beef shredded into a thick white cream sauce, served over a base of fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal cooked down into a porridge, let to solidify, then sliced and fried hard in a pan until the edges crisped. Underneath the cream sauce, it was soft. At the edges, it was almost crunchy. The same menu listed butter-boiled potatoes alongside it, and syrup bread, and orange marmalade, and oatmeal cookies and coffee. This was breakfast. Not a special occasion breakfast, a Tuesday in January. A full spread assembled before 5 in the morning by a cook who had been awake since 3. Number 10. Coffee in a soup bowl. In the Pacific Northwest logging camps, which came a generation later than the Great Lakes operations and were run by larger companies with more resources, tea gave way entirely to coffee. Strong, dark, industrial volume coffee. So much of it that the standard vessel was not a cup. It was a soup bowl. One journalist who documented Pacific Northwest logging life around 1900 noted that a single logger might account for nearly a pound of ground coffee a week. A pound. Ground in the cookhouse, brewed in buckets, poured into soup bowls because the cups were not big enough. The Pacific Northwest companies had ranches and farms supplying the camps, so the food had gotten considerably better than what the Great Lakes men ate a generation earlier. But the coffee, served in soup bowls with no apology, was in a category of its own. Number 11. Caramel rolls. Twice a week if the cook was in a good mood. That was the rule at better camps. Rob Berg, a food historian who ran the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum in Michigan, documented it in his writing about Great Lakes logging food traditions. The cook would bake pans of caramel rolls. Dark sugar, butter, yeast bread spiraled and glazed, and set them at the end of the table. They were not guaranteed. They depended on the cook. And because the cook was the highest paid employee in the camp, often more than the foreman, and because the men would follow a good cook from operation to operation across multiple seasons, the caramel rolls were a signal, a twice-a-week reminder that this was a camp worth staying in. Number 12. Hardtack crackers. In Charles Ellis's 1885 account of the northern Michigan camp, the one with 55 men over 20 weeks, he listed 8 barrels of crackers among the provisions. Hardtack. Simple flour and water crackers baked bone dry, designed to last without refrigeration for months. They went with everything. They went with the bean soup. They went with the creamed beef. They went in the pocket of a man heading out before dawn, with no guarantee of a noon meal. By the standards of Great Lakes logging cuisine, they were not exciting, a pale square of dense nothing, but they showed up in the provision lists of every camp, year after year, because they were reliable. In a world with no refrigeration and no resupply route for 3 months, reliability was everything. Number 13. Dried apple pie, the pregnant, that was the actual camp nickname for it. The men called dried apple pie the pregnant woman's pie, because when you sealed dried apples inside a pastry shell and put it in the oven, the apples absorbed moisture and swelled. The crust would rise and bulge. Rob Berg, who recreated logging camp food traditions at the Hartwick Pines Museum, documented this name as part of the spoken tradition of Great Lakes lumberjacks. The pies were baked by the dozen, iron tins made by camp blacksmiths, used season after season. Dried apples kept indefinitely. Fresh apples did not survive the supply chain. So you dried them in fall and sealed them in barrels and used them through the winter. And when they hit the hot oven, inside a lard-heavy pastry shell, they became something remarkable. Tart, a little sticky, soft in the center, and slightly browned at the edges. The men ate them by the slice and then went back to work. Number 14. Vinegar pie. The Great Lakes version of the logging camp pie is the one that almost nobody has eaten since the camps closed. Vinegar pie was made from pantry staples that never ran out: sugar, flour, eggs, butter, vinegar, water. No fruit required, no seasonings that needed to be ordered in advance. The vinegar provided the acid the fruit would have supplied, cut against the sweetness of the sugar, and the result was a custard-like filling. Tart at the edges, sweet at the center, slightly firm. Rob Berg still makes it at the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum Living History Program from the original recipe. He describes it as his personal favorite of all the logging camp foods he has reconstructed. Nobody else makes it. The name alone drives people away. That is the entire story of how a food vanishes. Number 15. Shoepack pie and Loringen pie. These names appear in the written records of Michigan logging camps. Rob Berg documented them, and that is nearly all that survives of them. Shoepack pie was a logging camp term for a particular style of pastry, the shoepack being the waterproof boot the men wore in the deep snow. Loringen pie was regional, associated with specific lumber operations in the Upper Peninsula. What went inside them is not fully documented. The names are artifacts now, words floating free of their recipes. Someone in a Michigan lumber camp in 1888 knew exactly what shoepack pie tasted like. That knowledge died with them. These two names are what we have left. Number 16. Cookies as large as dinner plates, given out like currency. Carrie Blodorn described it this way. Cookies were portable, handheld, and given out like currency. The bakers in large logging camps made them enormous, the size of a grown man's palm, sometimes larger, because a small cookie was not going to survive in the pocket of a man heading into 16-degree weather for 6 hours without a break. The cookies were dense, often molasses-heavy, hard enough to withstand being carried and jostled and half forgotten. When the cookie came out to the work sites with the noon meal, the cookies came too. They were traded. A man who had done a particularly demanding stretch of work might get 2 cookies to another man's 1. They were a small economy inside a closed system. Number 17. The noon piece. This is the one that hits hardest. Not because it was complicated, because it was not. The noon piece was what they called the midday meal that the cookie, the cook's assistant, loaded onto a horse-drawn sled or wagon and hauled more than a mile through the frozen woods to wherever the work crews had gotten to by midday. Cold salt pork, thick bread, baked beans that had already been warm once and were now somewhere between tepid and frozen, cookies in a crate, a jug of hot coffee or tea wrapped in cloth to hold what heat it could. And in winter, the cookie also loaded the blankets off the men's bunks, so the crew could wrap themselves against the cold while they ate. The men sat in the snow or stood around a fire the cookies had built at the edge of the cutting. They had 20 minutes. They ate. They went back to work. Nobody spoke. There was no table, no chair, no comfort. Just the food and the cold and the knowledge that there were still 6 hours of daylight left. That is what the noon peace was. And when the camps closed it with them, no restaurant ever served it. No diner put cold salt pork on a lunch menu. It simply ceased to exist. Number 18. Mashed turnips. The 1923 Maine lumber camp dinner menu, preserved in the Maine State Museum, listed mashed turnips alongside the roast pork loin and green peas. Not mashed potatoes, mashed turnips. Turnips were easier to store than potatoes in many conditions. Sturdier in the root cellar, with a slightly peppery sweetness that potatoes did not have. The camps built root cellars for exactly this kind of vegetable. The Dixie Stewart, secretary of the Tahquamenon Logging Museum in Michigan, documented the full list. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, onions, rutabaga. All of them kept through a Michigan winter. Most of them have long since disappeared from American tables. Rutabaga, parsnip, turnip, they are the forgotten vegetables of a diet built for survival. Number 19. Oatmeal pudding with milk sauce. The 1917 logging camp dinner menu shows it as the dessert. Oatmeal pudding with milk sauce. Not a pie, not a cookie. Oatmeal pudding, a steamed or baked preparation of oatmeal, bound with egg and sugar, served warm with a thin pour of milk sauce across the top. The whole camp ran on oats in various forms. The morning porridge was oats. The cookies were sometimes oat-based. And at the end of the dinner, when the men had already eaten corn soup and baked fish and mashed potatoes, they got oatmeal pudding. It sounds unremarkable. But this was 1917, in a logging camp in the deep American woods, and the cook had been on his feet since before 3 in the morning. That oatmeal pudding was a small, quiet act of care. Number 20. Syrup bread with orange marmalade. The same preserved early 1900s breakfast menu that listed creamed dried beef and fried. Cornmeal mush also listed syrup bread and orange marmalade alongside the rest. Syrup bread was bread enriched or glazed with a sweetener, molasses usually, or the camp's supply of maple syrup. The orange marmalade was a preserve, shipped in, rare, citrus being a luxury this far from any warm coast, and the fact that it appeared on a breakfast table in the middle of a logging operation is a small window into something unexpectedly civilized. The camp cook did not have to serve marmalade. He could have left it out. He chose to put it on the table. Someone who worked 14 hours a day in frozen timber deserved orange marmalade if there was orange marmalade to be had. Number 21. Pineapple pie in a Maine forest. In 1923, at a Maine lumber camp, whose menu was preserved by the Maine State Museum, the dessert at a Thursday dinner was pineapple pie. Pineapple. In a Maine forest in 1923, the canned goods revolution had reached the deep woods by then, and with it came the extravagance of fruit from elsewhere. Fruit that no northeastern forest had ever grown, arriving in tin cans on a supply wagon. The men who ate that pineapple pie had been eating dried apple pie and vinegar pie all winter. The pineapple was a revelation. Carrie Blodorn described what that moment meant in the camps. The cook who served something unexpected, something that nobody had seen coming, was the cook whose men came back the following season without being asked. Number 22. Biscuits and thin bean soup. This is the one that Charles Ellis could not forgive. In his 1885 account of northern Michigan logging camps, he described what bad cooking looked like. Bean soup, where the beans were so hard they cracked between your teeth. The water as clear as when it started, with bits of broken cracker floating in it that seemed to sail in slow circles. Hot soda biscuits, heavy with lard, a spoonful of flour to a quart of soda, badly risen. Salt meat half-boiled, potatoes the same, fried pork in cold grease. This was the bad camp, the belly robber camp. The camp where the cook was called a belly robber by the men because he stole the nutrition from their food through incompetence. Ellis documented the men enduring it with what he called the amiability of New England dyspeptics. They did not complain. They did not leave. They ate what was put in front of them and went back out into the cold. Not every logging camp was the good kind. Number 23, Lorangan Pie, a name that survives without a recipe. Documented in Michigan logging camp traditions. Rob Berg notes it, alongside shoepack pie and vinegar pie, as one of the regional specialties that identified a particular logging operation, a particular cook, a particular season. Lorangan might have been a family name. It might have been a family name. It might have been a place name. It might have been a corruption of a word that nobody alive can now identify. The pie itself is gone. The men who made it are gone. The name is all that is left. A word that meant something once in a cookhouse in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and now floats free, attached to nothing. Number 24, Rita Chiason's home fries with hot dog patties. Rita Chiason was a divorced mother of 5 who became a traveling cook for lumberjacks in the Adirondack Mountains. Her interview tape and transcript are held at the Adirondack Museum. She traveled from camp to camp, cooking for crews of men who were sometimes kind and sometimes difficult, and she came up with creative solutions to the ingredient problems every camp cook faced. One of the dishes the men responded to most strongly was home fries. Fried potatoes, diced and browned, mashed together in the pan with hot dog patties, and fried together in lard until the whole thing was crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and savory throughout. It does not sound like a recipe from a professional kitchen. It sounds like a person who was trying to feed a dozen hungry men with whatever was in the larder. That is exactly what it was. And the men loved it. It does not sound like a recipe from a professional kitchen. It sounds like a person who was trying to feed a dozen hungry men with whatever was in the larder. That is exactly what it was, and the men loved it. Number 25, the River Drive Ration. This is the one that closes the story. Every spring, when the ice broke on the rivers, the logging operations sent their men out onto the water to guide the season's timber downstream to the mills. Mills. This was the most dangerous work of the logging year. Year. Men spent 10 days or more in half-frozen rivers soaked through, sleeping in tents on the bank. Working from before dawn until after dark in temperatures that froze their gear between shifts. And through all of it, they ate one thing: baked beans, sourdough biscuit, molasses. That was the River Drive ration. Sometimes tea. 5 meals a day of the same 3 things, eaten standing up at the edge of the river, handed to them by the cookie who had to find them wherever they were. Wherever they were. The 1904 USTA study documented what happened to the men on the River Drive. They ate 25% less food overall because the conditions suppressed appetite. They lost a few pounds even eating 5 times a day. And the beans, just the beans, were what kept them going. Not because they were delicious. Because they were the most calorie-dense, protein-rich, portable, keep without a refrigeration food that could be made at scale in the middle of a frozen American river valley in 1902. That was the whole meal, beans and biscuit and molasses, 5 times a day. That was what Survival looked like before we decided we were too sophisticated to eat from a tin bowl in the snow. Here is why all of this vanished. Not because somebody decided it was obsolete, not because any law changed. The Great Lakes forests were gone by 1910, logged out, stripped bare, the industry moved west. The camps emptied. The men went home to cities and factory jobs, and a country that was building suburbs and installing refrigerators and opening supermarkets. You do not need 6,000 calories a day when you sit at a desk. You do not need a beanhole when you have a gas range. The camp cook tradition died with the camps. There was no culinary school that taught it, no restaurant chain that preserved it, no family table that carried it forward. The cookhouses closed one by one, and the belly robbers and godamites and cookies dispersed into ordinary American life and took their knowledge with them. And then they died, and that was it. There is one exception. In Samoa, California, on the northern coast, there is a building called the Samoa Cookhouse. It has been serving food lumber camp style since 1890. Family style, in big bowls and platters, with seconds always available. In a dining room lined with photographs of men with axes standing beside trees the size of buildings. It is the last survive-and-G cookhouse of the American West. As of 2023, it is temporarily closed for renovations. But it exists. The building exists. The tradition in one place survived. You can make these things. Beanhole beans require a cast iron pot, a shovel, and a yard. Vinegar pie requires a pantry. Sourdough biscuits require a starter you can make from flour and water in 48 hours. The caramel rolls, the dried apple pie, the oatmeal porridge, these were not exotic. They were made by people who had no specialty stores, no precise measuring cups, no imported equipment. They were made by exhausted people before dawn, at scale, in a log building, at the edge of the American wilderness. If your grandfather worked in the woods, if your grandmother came from a family that did, if you have ever had someone in your family describe a meal that was nothing fancy but filled something in you that a grocery store never quite has, then you already know what this was. That world is not completely gone. It is just waiting for someone to dig it up.